Welcome to the webinar, Managing Costs and Risk with Defensible Deletion. This webinar will be presented by Jim McGann. Jim is the Vice President of Marketing at Index Engines. Jim has an extensive experience with eDiscovery and information management in the Fortune 2000 sector. He is a frequent writer and speaker on the topics of big data, backup tape remediation, electronic discovery, and records management. He has written articles for ARMA, ILTA, Forbes, Insight Council, and other leading publications. Please type any questions for Jim in the question area on the right of your screen, and he will get to them at the end of the webinar. So let's begin. Jim?
Thanks, Jen. Thanks, everybody, for attending today's session. Today we're going to be talking about defensible deletion. This is a fairly new space within the information governance framework that really talks about managing and controlling data, and defensible deletion is definitely becoming a hot topic for records management and information management professionals around the globe. A quick introduction for those of you that are not familiar with Index Engines. We are an information management and archiving platform. Supports a lot of compliance, litigation, legal hold initiatives. Some of the key features of Index Engines is that we can provide detailed knowledge of data assets. So we're going to talk a little bit about things like data mapping, data classification, across both current data as well as legacy data that's in the enterprise. It's a very efficient platform that can very easily integrate into existing corporate infrastructures, allows policy to be executed. It also allows policy to be refined and defined for those organizations that are in the constant challenge of updating corporate initiatives. So you can really define policy based on the data map and data classification reports and so on. And I'll show you how that works. Also, ability to support legal hold and compliance. A lot of the eDiscovery activity. So the concept really is that we support, proactive initiatives around information management, as well as still maintain, the ongoing business requirements for eDiscovery to be able to support those holding compliance requirements against the data. As a company, Index Engines has been in the market since 2004. We have patented technology in both the U.S. and Europe, so it is very unique capabilities. And our clients range anywhere from Fortune 2000, well, actually beyond the Fortune 2000. We sell into a wide range of organizations, mostly companies that are that are public companies that are dealing with regulatory and compliance issues. Government agencies, law firms. We also have over 50 service partners worldwide that are utilizing Index Engines technology, mostly for eDiscovery initiatives, although we have a number of partners that work with us on policy initiatives and compliance initiatives as well. So the enterprise data environment, most of the folks on this call today are in the records management, information management space. So this is an area that is something that's near and dear to your heart and something that probably keeps you awake at night. The enterprise data environment is typically a complex environment, significant volumes of data. I mean, we talk to customers that are in the tens or hundreds of, they're in the petabytes versus terabytes, so it's grown significantly over the past number of years. The challenge is the data is not really easily accessible. As it's created, it gets locked in proprietary repositories. Emails such as Microsoft Exchange and Lotus Notes are really proprietary containers of email, as you know. Backup is another one. I know a lot of organizations kind of ignore the backup content, but we're going to talk about that today, as backup does contain valuable records and unmanaged records that really need to be managed. In a typical enterprise environment, everything's saved. Most organizations have policy, but may not implement policy, but enforce policy across all data environments. So users save everything. As you know, they want to save all their email and all their files. They're afraid to delete anything. IT saves everything. They copy everything onto backup tapes on the back end of the infrastructure. It's really been a big challenge, with content being copied and preserved and not purged. So copied over and over again. So when you create a single file, a spreadsheet, or a presentation, or a document, it's replicated and replicated and replicated, especially if you email it around. So everything's saved, and not only saved, but copied and replicated. Users have a lot of power. We talk to organizations all the time where users can save files on remote servers, on their desktop, wherever they like within the infrastructure. They also have the ability to create little mini email archives, such as PSTs. So a PST is really an archive of all their personal email, stuff that was sent and received by them. And then they typically archive those on their desktops or local servers they have access to. But it really is, again, a mini archive. So giving the user the ability to create these mini archives gives them a lot of power, because we have customers that have gotten into a lot of trouble because of PSTs. They may have corporate policy in place or an archive in place to manage corporate email. However, these PSTs may be saving something that was purged out of the corporate email repository, which kind of conflicts with the retention strategies. And generally, lack of knowledge. I mean, we hear every day from our clients that they really don't understand and have a difficulty of profiling the data assets, what exists on the network, what exists on these large filers and servers. Especially as data ages. As it ages, it kind of slowly fades into the infrastructure. It's difficult to find and manage. I mean, we have clients that have even large, archives in place that can't find data within the archive. So, they to the best of their ability, organizations put these infrastructures and processes in place, but it's difficult to understand what exists out there. And there's really no master directory of the content, no real idea of where things exist, who owns them, what type of data it is, what's the age, and so on. So if you look at a typical corporate architecture, and for the sake of this presentation, obviously it's going to be very simplified, you've got your user desktops. So users, create the files. That's really where the content's created, most of the content's created. Create their files, documents, and store it on their hard drives. Email can be archived into PSTs. If it's not archived into PSTs, it's contained on the corporate email server, which is a good thing. And that's basically a simplistic profile of a user desktop. Corporate servers, servers can have hundreds of terabytes of data, significant volumes of content. It's really, IT's domain. IT manages and organizes this content, continually increases capacity. That's the challenge, is that storage is perceived to be cheap. So organizations continue to add terabytes and terabytes of storage on an ongoing basis. Users typically have access to these servers to share data and archive content. So a lot of users will typically back up content there, store content there, or share it there. If you have a manufacturing organization where they share some common files on a shared server, is a typical deployment. Then you've got the email server. That's really the home of the most sensitive data. Email is really corporate communications and records and so on. A lot of the sensitive eDiscovery and compliance and regulatory requirements revolve email. There's no real easy way to manage this dynamic environment. I mean, a lot of organizations have put in email archives, which replicate email into the email archive, but we found that those archives have become bloated and difficult to manage and become less and less productive. So using the active server as a tool to be able to do discovery on and management of the email, it becomes challenging because it's very dynamic and changes constantly. And then finally, backup. Backup's one of those areas that people typically ignore, but it's a really sensitive environment just because it's really a snapshot or a copy of all your corporate data. So if you think about the content that exists, over here within, the servers and the email and desktops, all this content is replicated into backup. So it's copied for business continuity. So if you're working on the three boxes here on the left in managing that content and ignoring the backup, you could be purging data thinking that it's cleaned out or cleared from your network, or you've managed that liability, whereas a copy exists in backup. So, in the past it was fine because the data was very inaccessible, burdensome, expensive to get access to. But with today's technology, since we'll talk about, it becomes very seamless and cost-effective to get access to, and best practices are really focused on the remediation and management of that content. So if you look at those 4 different data stores, kind of break it out in that way, we'll use that as a theme throughout the presentation. So what we're going to talk about is obviously the data that exists in those environments, and we're going to talk about the concept of defensible deletion. So depending on the type of your business, you hear different statistics, and I have some stats on the following slide. We see in some cases 90% or more of data, of user data, is not really required for long-term retention, especially as it ages and you've got duplicate copies and it's very redundant, and it loses value over time. So, it's your everyday working documents, different versions of proposals or manufacturing documents or spreadsheets, email correspondence. The bulk of email correspondence could be spam or privileged information from your outside counsel, or it could just be stuff that's really, not of any kind of business value to the organization. So understanding enough about this data, separate and classify it is really the challenge. What should be kept and what shouldn't be kept, and that's really the objective of policy, and policy is going to define really, what kind of specific intellectual property or sensitive content or business records need to be archived or retained for long-term, and that can be based on, metadata or content or specific keywords within the document. So you could have regulatory requirements to save specific users or custodian mail for a period of time, 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, or even just 90 days. So, defensible deletion is about creating, updating policies and determining what these policies are and what needs to be kept and what could be purged. Obviously, ongoing regulatory compliance requirements, active litigation obligations, and so on, and applying policy against the data. So we talk to IT organizations all the time that know they want to purge data and clean up and get rid of data, but they can only do this in conjunction with an active policy that's well-defined and defensible. So basically, separating out what is required for long-term retention and archiving it in the archive, and purging what is no longer required after an appropriate time frame. So here's some stats, and they're kind of interesting perspective on data. The first stat is from Gartner Group, and the paper is referenced there as well, if you like to dig up one of those copies. But the challenge in data growth, and you hear a lot about big data, is that data currently is growing at a rate of 40 to 60% every year. It's massive growth. It's just exploding out there. So for corporations that are struggling to manage data in its environment today, just wait. Next year you're going to have about 50% more data to manage. So it's a really challenging undertaking. The next stat is again from Gartner, talking about through 2013, 95% of information management programs will depend on reducing IT costs and managing information risk. So a lot of the goal of records managers and information management has been around managing risk, securing data that needs to be secure and controlled, and also to manage compliance and things like that. But the issue there is that the IT role of managing costs, which is definitely on the top of everybody's mind, especially in this economy, it is definitely going to be folded into the mix there. So managing cost is definitely one of the key advantages of defensible deletion, but defensible deletion is also a process to be able to manage risk. So it's kind of folds into both areas. So we're seeing a lot of interest on defensible deletion for information management professionals. And finally, the last one that's interesting is saying, kind of contradicts the first two, saying, data is growing about 50% a year. IT cost is a big issue, but according to IBM, it's a great, it's a short article that's in Forbes, and it's pretty easy to find. It's a current article saying IBM did a study and says about 69% of information in most companies has no business, legal, or regulatory value. So if the records management or information management teams could focus on the 69%, start cleaning it up, you're going to really eliminate this data growth, and you're going to have a significant impact here on IT costs. So it's all folding together, and I think a lot of the analysis and the studies are showing that there's a lot of room for cleanup, a lot of content that can be purged, and it's going to significantly have an impact on risk as well as IT costs. So if you look at those different environments, again, the desktops, network servers, email, and the backup tapes here on the right, what companies are asking for, and we get requests for this all the time since we're in the space, is really an enterprise index, something that really understands all the content across all those different environments, all those media sources and repositories. So to understand those environments so you can understand, help evolve your policy, help develop a policy, help apply your policy, and help audit your policy. So you can really just manage that information. So the enterprise index really is the go-to location to really understand what you have. You need that actionable enterprise index so you can apply policy on top of it and take the appropriate action on the data, and really focus on culling down this large set of content here down to really what needs to be maintained for legal hold and preservation or other business and compliance requirements. And again, the percent of data that represents is a significantly smaller percent that exists in the enterprise today. So if we talk about the concept of defensible deletion here, so one of the things that we hear on the user desktop side is really what organizations are considering best practice here is really controlling what is saved on the user's desktop. So having the users to be able to store significant volumes of data, and remember, today's desktop can store, the hard drives on there could be in the terabytes. So storing terabytes of data on their desktop, it really becomes the size of some enterprise class servers that exist out there. So the larger the drive on those desktops, the more content and the more risk or liability could exist on their desktops. And users will tend to hoard everything. Users just don't want to delete any content. So controlling what is saved on their desktop, we have some organizations or some clients of ours that are going to the lengths of just eliminating desktop storage and requiring all users to store their data centrally on the network so it's managed easier to manage. So controlling what's on the desktop. On servers, applying policy as to data as it ages, so stop letting data just age on there. So think about data from ex-employees that just stays archived on those servers and no one knows anything about it, and it will just stay there and just fade into the infrastructure as it ages there. So by applying policy, you can extract content into the archive and clean up those environments. Again, apply policy to email as well and purging old email. A lot of organizations are just migrating all email into a email archive, and just what they're doing is going the opposite direction of cleaning up email. What they're doing is making another copy of it and replicating all their email into the archive without applying policy to it. And it's just making the challenge even greater. And then finally on legacy tapes, remediating legacy content on tapes, and I'll show you, we'll talk about that further in the presentation, but with with the technology I'm going to talk to you about today, remediation is something that is very cost effective and eliminate those snapshots or those archives and images that have been backed up over years. So how we approach this? So that's a great concept. How do you approach this defensible deletion methodology? So the first thing I want to talk about is data mapping. And data mapping is a concept that's been around for a bit. You may be referring to it as data classification and so on. Or you may be familiar with some of the older techniques around data mapping, which is really done through interviews. But what we're going to talk about here with data mapping is how you can develop policy using a data map. Organizations have thousands of servers and desktops, as we talked about. The dynamic environment, continually changing, massive volume of data, very complex. So what we talk about here in this environment is very difficult to develop these policies. You really can't understand the liability of the content. As users change jobs or leave, knowledge is lost. So if you have IT professionals that are managing specific servers and they leave, the knowledge of what exists on those servers, what used to exist on those servers is lost. And as data ages, it becomes less accessible. So one of the stories I'll tell you here is that we have a client that we're working with to build some data maps, so they're in the process of developing a information governance strategy, and the first step really is data mapping so they can help refine and manage your policy. They do have an existing policy in place where users don't have the ability to create PSTs, so they can't create those little mini email archives on their desktops, and that's been in place for a while. So we put the data map in place. We indexed their content, crawled through their networks, created a profile of their information, and lo and behold, we find there's tens of thousands of PSTs across their infrastructure. So clearly, they created a policy, thought they implemented it, never really audited it, and found that obviously there was issues there. So the nice thing about data mapping is it's able to give you that view into the content to know what is the policy, is it being enforced, audit the policy, and determine how it needs to be fine-tuned. So in terms of data mapping, what we're talking about is a bit different from the traditional data maps. Traditional data maps have been based on interviews, on-site interviews, and more of a manual process in determining the infrastructure, what type of data is on what server, what department owns it, what's the sensitivity of the content, what types of applications, and so on. You can use indexing technology. And indexing technology has gotten such that it's very efficient, very cost-effective, and can scale to the enterprise type deployment. And what that allows you to do is to understand the content and the metadata that exists out there. Includes current data and legacy data. So you can do data mapping across your current servers and desktops all the way back through the legacy backup tapes, which is valuable in the remediation of that content. So once you have a layer that sits across all your classes of enterprise storage, you can summarize and classify the content, generate reports of data by owners, location, age, and so on, determine the sensitivity of those locations and any liabilities that may exist. So we have customers that have been struggling with policy and developing policy for many years. I mean, it's kind of an overwhelming task, as you know, but once they put in a data map, they're able to develop a playbook, and the playbook is really what's going to be our approach to this content, determine the course of action of this data, what to attack first. So if you look at the playbook, and the data map, you can say, let's find the most sensitive content based on these reports. So you're a manufacturing organization, you may determine that some of the manufacturing divisions or departments may have the most sensitive content, so let's focus on their data and attack it first. You may focus on cleaning up legacy content. So that's kind of a house cleaning task where you've got copies of data that goes back 10, 15, 20 years. Let's focus on that content and clean that up, because that's the kind of stuff that shows up during litigation or any kind of merger or acquisition event that creates a lot of surprise and a lot of frustration is that content that's there. And then, the playbook can implement an ongoing process to manage new data. How do you incorporate the index across new content in order to apply policy to that data? And then, use outside counsel to sign off on the process. So with a data map that's blessed by your outside counsel, it's a defensible, really, playbook that allow you insight into your data to support things like eDiscovery, to support things like data, defensible deletion, will support things like archiving, and so on. So the index itself, when you index these different repositories, from desktops down to legacy tapes, you can get a lot of rich metadata content, which will allow you to make decisions about the data. So, for example, you can find who owns it. So here it helps you look for things like ex-employee content. You can look at access time. So if you're storing data on your network that hasn't been accessed for 7 years, could you develop policy around that to purge that data? You can look at other things like file types and things like that. Owners, I mentioned owners as well. So there's a number of other things we can talk about here. But the reports that you can generate across those metadata fields are dynamic. You can drill down into the reports. So here's a good example. So you can report on specific custodians. So, for example, if you're doing some analysis of specific users, like say John Doe here, you can say, show me all John Doe's content. Here you can figure out where they stored spreadsheets. So show me all John Doe's file types by spreadsheet, and then flip over the report that says show me the locations of this content. Find other users who store spreadsheets on the server, so once you're on that server, you can expand it out and say who else stores there, and then determine which spreadsheets were accessed by in the last 90 days of that user. So you can kind of iterate through stuff and get an idea of who owns what, where they located, who else is storing stuff there, who's accessing this content, and so on. Okay, so the reports are based on the metadata and can be downloaded and analyzed and really manipulated based on your requirements. So here's an example of, let's look at, let's say the finance department. Let's keep it simple. We'll just look at 5 different users. So if we look at user-based data mapping, what you can do is you can import a list of custodians into Index Engine's interface or data mapping interface. For example, we have a client that's heavily involved in obviously the financial services industry, heavily concerned about the mortgage crisis and preparing for lawsuits that'll happen as a result of that mortgage crisis. So what they're doing is they're building an environment where they can archive a significant volume of custodian mailboxes based on their email address and date range. So they're importing a list of these custodians into the system. You can then generate a report of where all this content is. So it may be obvious. So if you're really looking for just email, you may consider that the email server is the obvious choice. In this case, however, with these users, even if it's just email, you can have PSTs on different servers, like server X and server Y. You'll have copies of the email on legacy backup tapes, and obviously you have email within the email server. That's really the more current content that's on the active email server. But you'll have legacy versions of email which become more sensitive on tape, as well as PSTs that would sit on these server environments. So when you think about email, the obvious location is the email server. That's going to give you the current stuff. But there's lots of little nooks and crannies and archives that exist that a data map will show you and prove out that this, and give you the tool you need to be able to discover, find it, and manage it. So once you narrow it down to those locations, you can profile the data. So beyond email, you can say what type of data do these users have? Email files, databases, and such. What's the age of the data? When was the last modified or accessed? What kind of email exchange went between these different users? Show me hidden data. Again, the PSTs on remote desktops. Show me shared and duplicate content. So you can kind of iterate through these different reports, analyze it, and really determine the content that exists, the risk, the liability. This is also really, data maps are also really powerful for eDiscovery requests, because if you happen to have an eDiscovery request for, say, user 1, you can just look to the data map and say, hey, you want email? I know where all the email is located, and I can go point you in the right direction, versus traditional eDiscovery activity, which is kind of finding a needle in the haystack without much guidance. So so that's a bit about data mapping. So back to defensible deletion. So if you look at these different areas, we talked about creating a map of all this content, so profiling what exists across here. But if we want to start getting into the specific concept of deletion of data or defensively deleting data, one of the first areas that organizations that we work with start is really around legacy tapes. So this is your backup tapes. And the best practice here is to remediate that content. So we work with organizations that have attempted to manage their legacy tapes and haven't had much success because it has been expensive. We work with organizations that don't even know that they have legacy tapes, don't even know how many they have, which is more common. So the mystery of it and the unknown aspect of legacy tapes is something that just needs to be incorporated within the defensible deletion or information governance framework. So what is legacy tape remediation? So if you're a typical organization, you're going to have tens or hundreds of thousands of legacy tapes. We have customers or clients that have millions of legacy tapes. We have clients that have 5,000 or 10,000 legacy tapes. It really depends on your backup environment, how aggressive your IT organization was in saving them. saving that content. The important point is that these tapes contain a complete snapshot of all the corporate data for decades. So it's going to be all your executive team emails, all your sensitive manufacturing records, a lot of intellectual properties on those tapes. And that was the purpose of the tapes, is to create a snapshot of the corporate networks for disaster recovery purposes. So it's pretty comprehensive. And organizations we deal with are constantly surprised by what they see on these legacy tapes. In the past, again, those tapes were very expensive and very burdensome to get access to, so they were easily ignored. In today's, with today's technology here, which we're talking about, index engines technology, access to that content is easy. So, I talked to a guy that a couple of years ago spent $110,000 to produce email from a single legacy tape. We have a services lab that can access anything you want from that tape for between $500 and $1,000 a tape. So you can see that the cost has just been reduced, and the proportionality of what it would cost to manage that content has changed significantly. So don't sell these short. I mean, you need to consider them in your records management strategies. The thing is that you have stockpiles of these tapes, but IT is continuing to make these tapes. And the point is, as IT makes the tapes, there's a point that they need to make a decision about what to keep and what not to keep. IT can't distinguish that, so they keep everything. So it's easy to store these things off-site, and organizations like Iron Mountain and Recall are full of these tapes. And they are archives. I mean, you may deny that they're an archive, but they are an archive because IT has no purpose for them. They're being saved because the organization knows that they have stuff that's of value on there, which is archived content, but can't separate it out. So they turn into a liability, and there has been fines and sanctions. I mean, obviously, the well-cited University of Montreal pension plan case, where Judge Shailen talked about backup tapes, and as she so often does. But when you have judges and lawyers that are becoming knowledgeable about this area, it becomes a high-risk environment. So, tape remediation, the return on investment is there. It makes sense. We have customers that are spending more to store these tapes than it would cost to remediate them. So it's projects that are really already funded. You're really just taking the investment or the expense that you're paying to offsite storage vendors and reallocating that to manage that liability. So we do have a return on investment process that we can take you through if you're interested. And here's an example of one where a client has 14,000 legacy backup tapes. Obviously, the tapes are difficult to access. The unique thing about index engines is we have direct tape indexing technology. So instead of having to use the original environment that created the tapes and restore the content to figure out what's there, you can directly scan the tapes, create a data map of the content, search the data map, determine what you need to get access to, whether it be a specific email or file or a full user mailbox, and extract that from tape directly, maintaining forensic soundness of the data, and basically apply policy to that content, get off what you need, store it in the archive, and remediate those tapes. And the typical numbers that we see on tape remediation is that less than 1% of what exists on the tapes is really what needs to be archived. The rest is stuff that has no business value or no legal or compliance requirements, so it could be shredded and recycled. And those are programs we're going through with some of the Fortune 50 organizations out there. So it's a process and a methodology that's been proven out as cost effective, as you can see below. So you can see in this environment where they have had 14,000 tapes, you can see here if they wanted to process those tapes in 6 months, 12 months, or 18 months, it really just ramps up the number of engines they would need. You can see what the cost is, so the hardware, software, labor cost all in versus what they're spending. So I don't remember the actual number they were spending, but it seemed to be more than $50 a tape. But you can see the return on investment here was in less than a year. And here you need to also include the liability, which is the hard number to associate with this ROI, is what is the liability the cost of the liability of keeping that content. So again, so defensible deletion, we talked about tapes, email servers, applying policy to email. This is probably one of the areas that's more common, where people are putting in email archives. But applying policy to that content and use email archiving and use it intelligently where you're saving only what you need to save based on retention periods or legal or compliance purposes. But being able to index that content and deliver a view into that so you can apply policy, you really should only be saving what you need to. A lot of organizations that we've talked to have been saving all their email for a long period of time, and that just creates a lot of bloat in their archive and makes the archive difficult to manage. We constantly get requests to be able to index and extract and put content on legal hold that exists in their archive, showing that the archive has in fact failed. And we're focused on a next generation of archive that's really designed for legal hold and compliance purposes and preservation purposes. So, so implementing email archiving is a great component of the whole defensible deletion strategy by ensuring that you only archive and save what you really need to save and stop saving too much here. They're also stop archiving from backup tapes and really defensively purge what you don't need to save. So again, if you, we looked at legacy tapes, we looked at email, we looked at looking now at network servers, applying policy to that data as it ages, and that's really where a lot of the cost savings can come in. We have, clients that are using data mapping and indexing some of their servers. You can start with some of the high-risk servers like legal, finance, executives, and so on. Here's some examples of defensible deletion methodologies that save significant capacity within their storage environment, which could really eliminate the need for IT to buy massive volumes of storage for years to come. So you can look for any files here that have not been accessed for 5 years. I mean, any number you want here. So in this case, we'll just look at 5 years, it could be 7 years, 9 years, and so on. So we have organizations that are doing that, and even without applying legal policy to it, you can apply an IT or storage policy to it and just move that data to a cheaper environment like cloud, for example. There's a lot of technology that can do that really easily. You can look for files that are owned by ex-employees. I mean, no organization really cleans up ex-employee data as they leave, and a significant chunk of the data that's being stored on these online filers is really a lot of data that's owned by ex-employees. So, you can query all these ex-employees, find the data, and look for anything that hasn't been accessed in a year or 2 years or 3 years. So if it hasn't been accessed, it clearly has no business value, and maybe move that offline or purge that off the network. So those are two real simple examples of policies that can be applied from a purely IT point of view. Again, you could use the data map to go deeper into it and apply policies from a legal point of view as well. So the idea is to really focus on the archive. The archive is the hub of going to be the future hub of the data center and store all the relevant and important content. Stuff that's going to be on servers and desktops and email and so on. It's just really a temporary environment that is going to exist for a short period of time before policy gets applied to it and it gets either purged, archived, or put on less expensive storage environment. So again, if you look at those 4 areas, I know we're getting close to the end of the session. If you look at desktops, we talked about how we can attack that, but what I want to show you here is kind of how do we scale that stuff and how do we create focus on all that data, because a lot of organizations really face analysis paralysis when dealing with defensible deletion. It's like, I don't even know where to begin, and they end up overanalyzing it and just never get anywhere fast. So if you kind of look at the profile of the desktops, and this is a very simplistic view. I mean, your environment would obviously may have a different view, but if you look at desktops, typically it's lower volumes of data. Again, I mentioned that desktops could have terabyte drives on them, but typically the amount that users create on a daily basis is low volume. It's typically medium risk. It's again remembering that email is created on the email server and not on their desktop. So low volume, medium risk. Networks is high volume. Lots of data gets gets accumulated on these network servers, but typically low risk. I mean, for manufacturing organizations, it may be higher risks than others. Email servers, the volume, or I mean, if you look at purely gigabytes or terabytes, it's lower volume, it's lower storage capacity, but it may be a higher number. But it's high risk. It's probably some of the highest risk stuff that you'll have in your organization. If you look at legacy tapes, it's high volume again because it's just replication of all this stuff over and over and over again, and it's high risk because it incorporates email and everything. So if you start creating this profile, this map of the data at a high level and figuring out where is my stuff, what kind of content is it, what's the risk value, and you can go into lots of detail on this, and develop this map or this grid that kind of helps you focus your efforts into certain areas, and that kind of helps you circumvent that analysis paralysis environment. So again, if you start attacking this, and again, one of the strategies we talked about earlier was limiting what users can store on their desktops, especially PSTs, and control their storage capacity there, remediating legacy tapes. If you do those two things, you can eliminate significant issues around both sides of this defensible deletion challenge here, and so on. So I think there's lots of different approaches to this. I mean, this approach we were just talking about is one angle, but you get the idea. But what we have with our partners, we have some consulting partners and information governance and policy consulting partners that really have developed these playbooks, these defensible deletion playbooks, that are really valuable. So they'll help you, and obviously it's not one size fits all. It's really customized to the organization. But these playbooks are kind of a step-by-step process into information governance framework. So the first step is audit. So it's really about data mapping. Understand what you have. Then analyze the data map out sensitive content. And again, the data mapping is really the first step in any process where I just really don't think our policy is sound or our policy needs to be refined or updated. The data map is a great place to start because it's going to help you understand what you have. And developing a policy in a vacuum without knowing what you have is really a painful challenge. So the first step is really data mapping, analyze the data map, and then update or define your policy and your playbook. This is going to be our approach. These are going to be our procedures, and make sure it's defensible. So it's not going to be that's just be a manageable process that can be implemented on a consistent basis. And it's not going to be perfect, but you just need to make sure that it exists and it's applied. Ensure defensibility. Again, we have partners and legal advisors that can manage that process and make sure, hey, you know what, this policy and this playbook is defensible, and we'll vouch for it and we'll support you on it. And then start deleting, getting rid of what's not required. So start small with high-risk data. I mean, the examples I gave earlier about ex-employee data or managing PSTs that are not, let's say, show me all PSTs in the network that have been accessed in 5 years. Could be PSTs from ex-employees. Could be your one of your executives, admins, stored it out on a network drive to just archive it and forgot about it. So get rid of that stuff. So you can kind of start targeting that stuff. And I think looking at the data map and exploring it will give you a view into it and determine what to start targeting and what can be defensively purged out. And then archive what you need, for safekeeping, so segregate out what's required for long-term retention. Okay, so that's about it. If you do have questions, you should see a question or a chat area over there, the bottom right. Feel free to pop in a question, and we'll answer the questions. We don't really have that much time, so I don't think we'll take more than 1 or 2 questions. Also, if you do want a copy of a white paper that we have, it's a defensible deletion methodology white paper that kind of goes in line with the presentation that you heard today. You can shoot me an email. My email address is on the screen there. Or if you wanted to send a question in directly without doing it publicly, you can do that as well. Or if you just want to speak further about your situation, feel free to shoot an email in. But Jen, do we have any questions that came in?
Yes, we do. The first question, Jim, is, You mentioned a playbook. Do you have a playbook available that defines the process and methodology?
Like I said, we do have playbooks. We do have templates typically is what we use. And again, we have partners that are more methodology consultants and records management consultants, people like Merrill and others. Merrill is one of our bigger partners. What they do is they have kind of a toolkit. They also have surveys and stuff. So I think it's not really one size fits all. I mean, the playbook is really geared for your organization. So I think we have the questions to ask. We have the framework for it. We can definitely provide that for you and see how we can apply it to your organization. But I think it's not obviously cookie cutter. It's something that's really going to be customized for your environment. Okay, it's actually, I think we need to cut this short. We're only going to go 45 minutes. We're a little bit over. So again, if you do have questions, feel free to shoot them to me at the email address that you see there, and we'd be happy to get back to you. This will be recorded, so if you do want to get a copy of the recording, we'll send an email as well, and we'll send you a link for that. Thank you all for your time today. We appreciate it, and we look forward to speaking with you